In Chapter 4 of Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton is explaining how we might recover not only our wits, but also our humanity. In his day, it was clear that people were losing their minds. And in our day, it's only gotten a lot worse. We are now raving lunatics. To recover our reason, we need to rediscover the profound truths that are found in fairy tales. In the first parts of this chapter, Chesterton pointed out that we have a very narrow and therefore skewed view of reality. We think the world runs like a machine, according to a whole bunch of unbreakable, impersonal laws. What we call the laws of nature aren't laws at all, because the universe doesn't need to be the way it is. We know this because we can imagine it otherwise. It's irrational to call something a law that isn't. The truth is that the universe is full of mysteries and possibilities and wonder. In this video, Chesterton will make the case for seeing life as both a gift and a responsibility. Anyone can see it who will simply read Grimm's fairy tales or the fine collection of Mr. Andrew Lang. For the pleasure of pedantry, I will call it the doctrine of conditional joy. Touchstone talked of much virtue in an if. According to Elfland ethics, all virtue is an if. The note of the fairy utterance always is, you may live in a place of gold and sapphire, if you do not say the word cow. Or, you may live happily with the king's daughter, if you do not show her an onion. The vision always hangs upon a veto. All the dizzy and colossal things conceded depend upon one small thing withheld. All the wild and whirling things that are let loose depend upon one thing that is forbidden. Mr. W.B. Yeats, in his exquisite and piercing elfin poetry, describes the elves as lawless. They plunge into innocent anarchy on the unbridled horse of the air, ride on the crest of the disheveled tide, and dance upon the mountains like a flame. The poet W.B. Yeats didn't always get it right, and he certainly got it wrong when he said that fairyland is a place of unbounded freedom. This is not so. There is so much there that is wonderful and awesome and incredible, but if you break that one random rule, you lose it all. This idea is so pervasive in fairyland that Chesterton calls it a doctrine, the doctrine of conditional joy. It is a dreadful thing to say that Mr. W.B. Yeats does not understand fairyland. But I do say it. He is an ironical Irishman full of intellectual reactions. He is not stupid enough to understand fairyland. Fairies prefer people of the yokel type like myself. People who gape and grin and do as they are told. Mr. Yeats reads into Elfland all the righteous insurrection of his own race. But the lawlessness of Ireland is a Christian lawlessness, founded upon reason and justice. The Fenian is rebelling against something he understands only too well. But the true citizen of fairyland is obeying something that he does not understand at all. In the fairy tale, an incomprehensible happiness rests upon an incomprehensible condition. A box is open and all evils fly out. A word is forgotten and cities perish. A lamp is lit and love flies away. A flower is plucked and human lives are forfeited. An apple is eaten and the hope of God is gone. Aside from teasing Yeats for being Irish, Chesterton is explaining that the good things in fairy tales are conditional. You get to have them or keep them on one condition. The if. This or that will or won't happen if you do or don't do this or that. There are two things that we need to understand about this if that we must obey. First, it's incomprehensible. It makes no sense. There's no connection to the consequence. And the second thing is that the thing you aren't supposed to do seems like it's no big deal. It's a little thing. But everything hinges upon this little limitation that makes no sense. The reward for obedience is huge. It is often a whole kingdom. Did you notice that last example that Chesterton used? An apple is eaten and the hope of God is gone? That's not from a fairy tale. This is the tone of fairy tales, and it is certainly not lawlessness or even liberty. Though men under a mean modern tyranny may think it liberty by comparison, people out of Portland jail might think Fleet Street free, but closer study will prove that both fairies and journalists are slaves of duty. Fairy godmothers seem at least as strict as other godmothers. Cinderella received a coach out of Wonderland and a coachman out of nowhere, but she received a command, which might have come out of Brixton, that she should be back by 12. Also, she had a glass slipper, and it cannot be a coincidence that glass is so common a substance in folklore. This princess lives in a glass castle, that princess on a glass hill. This one sees all things in a mirror. They may all live in glass houses if they will not throw stones. For this thin glitter of glass everywhere is the expression of the fact that happiness is bright but brittle, like the substance most easily smashed by a housemaid or a cat. And this fairy tale sentiment also sank into me and became my sentiment towards the whole world. I felt and feel that life itself is as bright as a diamond, but as brittle as the window pane. And when the heavens were compared to the terrible crystal, I can remember a shudder. I was afraid that God would drop the cosmos with a crash. Fairy tales might seem to be without rhyme or reason to those who suffer under the stifling oppression of modern thinking. But there are rules in fairyland. One example of this doctrine of conditional joy is in the Cinderella story. Cinderella gets to be the belle of the ball. The ball. She's got a beautiful carriage and stately horses and that dress. And she gets all this on one condition. A little thing that makes no sense. She has to be home by midnight. In her flight from the ball, she loses a glass slipper. Chesterton points out that there is a lot of glass in the stories of the common folk. These glass things show us how brittle happiness is. So that's another fundamental truth in fairy tales. Happiness is a fragile thing. Remember, however, that to be breakable is not the same as to be perishable. Strike a glass and it will not endure an instant. Simply do not strike it and it will endure 1,000 years. Such it seemed was the joy of man, either in Elfland or on earth. The happiness depended on not doing something, which you could at any moment do, and which very often it was not obvious why you should not do. Now the point here is that to me, this did not seem unjust. If the miller's third son said to the fairy, "Explain why I must not stand on my head in the fairy palace," the other might fairly reply, "Well, if it comes to that, explain the fairy palace." If Cinderella says, "How is it that I must leave the ball at 12?" the godmother might answer, "How is it that you are going there till 12? If I leave a man in my will 10 talking elephants and 100 winged horses, he cannot complain if the conditions partake of the slight eccentricity of the gift. He must not look the winged horse in the mouth." And it seemed to me that existence itself was so very eccentric a legacy that I could not complain of not understanding the limitations of the vision when I did not understand the vision they limited. The frame was no stranger than the picture. The veto might well be as wild as the vision. It might be as startling as the sun, as elusive as the waters, as fantastic and terrible as the towering trees. Some might say, it's unfair. It's unfair that all happiness hinges upon a small random thing. A lot of teenagers I know in Cinderella's shoes would say, "It's so unfair. Why do we have to be home by midnight? No one else has to be home that early." But Chesterton argues that you can only think it's unfair if you only look at the small limitation and ignore the huge gift that comes from obedience. Cinderella had her curfew, but she got to be at the ball for, 5 hours? For this reason, we may call it the fairy godmother philosophy. I could never join the young men of my time in feeling what they called the general sentiment of revolt. I should have resisted, let us hope, any rules that were evil, and with these and their definition I shall deal in another chapter. But I did not feel disposed to resist any rule merely because it was mysterious. Estates are sometimes held by foolish forms, the breaking of a stick or the payment of a peppercorn. I was willing to hold the huge estate of earth and heaven by such a feudal fantasy. It could not well be wilder than the fact that I was allowed to hold it at all. At this stage I only give one ethical instance to show my meaning. I could never mix in the common murmur of the rising generation against monogamy, because no restriction on sex seems so odd and unexpected as sex itself. To be allowed, like Endymion, to make love to the moon, and then complain that Jupiter kept his own moons in a harem, seemed to me, bred on fairy tales like Endymion's, a vulgar anticlimax. Keeping to one woman is a small price for so much as seeing one woman. To complain that I could only marry once was like complaining that I had only been born once. It was incommensurate with the terrible excitement of which one was talking. It showed not an exaggerated sensibility to sex, but a curious insensibility to it. A man is a fool who complains that he cannot enter Eden by 5 gates at once. Polygamy is a lack of realization of sex. It is like a man plucking 5 pears in mere absence of mind. The ascetics touched the last insane limits of language in their eulogy on lovely things. The thistledown made them weep. A burnished beetle brought them to their knees. Yet their emotion never impressed me for an instant for this reason, that it never occurred to them to pay for their pleasure in any sort of symbolic sacrifice. Men, I felt, might fast 40 days for the sake of hearing a blackbird sing. Men might go through a fire to find a cowslip. If these lovers of beauty could not even keep sober for the blackbird, they would not go through common Christian marriage by way of recompense to the cowslip. Surely one might pay for extraordinary joy in ordinary morals. Oscar Wilde said that sunsets were not valued because we could not pay for sunsets. But Oscar Wilde was wrong. We can pay for sunsets. We can pay for them by not being Oscar Wilde. Apparently in Chesterton's day, young people were a little rebellious. Young people, as a rule, are always a little rebellious, especially if there are a lot of restrictions, and that might have been the case in Victorian England. They'd rebel against any rule that didn't make sense to them. Chesterton did not think it necessary to rebel against something just because you didn't understand it. A fairy tale lesson. He points out that estates are sometimes held by foolish forms, like the payment of a peppercorn. I wonder if he was thinking about Blenheim Palace. Blenheim Palace is one of the biggest and most beautiful buildings in England, as far as I'm concerned. Churchill was born there. It's apparently owned by the Crown, but the Duke of Marlborough gets to live there. But he's got to pay for the privilege. He pays what is called a peppercorn rent each year. In the case of Blenheim, it's not actually a peppercorn, but a little flag. He must deliver to the Crown, on or before August 13, a copy of the French royal flag, or he can't live in Blenheim anymore. This has been going on for centuries. I can't imagine anyone squawking about having to deliver a little flag to the king for the privilege of living in such an incredible estate. But lots of people do the equivalent. Sex, for example. Chesterton's contemporaries chafed at monogamy. God created this incredibly fun and wonderful thing, and then he put a little restriction on it: marriage. When people gripe about the limits of monogamy, it's like whining about having to give the Crown a little flag once a year for the privilege of living in Blenheim. Well, I left the fairy tales lying on the floor of the nursery, and have not found any book so sensible since. I left the nurse guardian of tradition and democracy, and I have not found any modern type so sanely radical or so sanely conservative. But the matter for important comment was here: that when I first went out into the mental atmosphere of the modern world, I found that the modern world was positively opposed on 2 points to my nurse and to the nursery tales. It has taken me a long time to find out that the modern world is wrong, and my nurse was right. The really curious thing was this: that modern thought contradicted this basic creed of my boyhood on its 2 most essential doctrines. I have explained that the fairy tale founded in me 2 convictions. First, that this world is a wild and startling place, which might have been quite different, but is quite delightful. Second, that before this wildness and delight, one may well be modest and submit to the queerest limitations of so queer a kindness. But I found the whole modern world running like a high tide against both my tendernesses, and the shock of that collision created 2 sudden and spontaneous sentiments, which I have had ever since, and which, crude as they were, have since hardened into convictions. Chesterton grew up and he left the fairy tales behind him, but as he began to engage with the modern world and modern thinking, he saw that the modern world opposed the 2 main truths of fairyland. He didn't realize it at first, but the fairy tales had it right, and the world had it wrong. The 2 truths? First, that the world is full of wonder, and it didn't need to be. But it is, and that's incredible. And second, that in such a world you need to humble yourself and submit to some weird limitations. But the modern world opposes both these doctrines. First, I found the whole modern world talking scientific fatalism, saying that everything is as it must always have been, being unfolded without fault from the beginning. The leaf on the tree is green because it could never have been anything else. Now the fairy tale philosopher is glad that the leaf is green precisely because it might have been scarlet. He feels as if it had been turned green an instant before he looked at it. He is pleased that snow is white, on the strictly reasonable ground that it might have been black. Every color has in it a bold quality as of choice. The red of garden roses is not only decisive but dramatic, like sudden spilt blood. He feels that something has been done. But the great determinists of the 19th century were strongly against this native feeling that something had happened the instant before. In fact, according to them, nothing ever really had happened since existence had happened. And even about the date of that, they are not very sure. Chesterton is laying the groundwork for how two spontaneous sentiments, created by hearing fairy tales in the nursery, became hardened convictions when they ran up against modern thinking. A big part of modern thinking is fatalism. The root word of fatalism is fate, this impersonal force that rules all things, and there's nothing that you can do to change what is going to happen. Scientific fatalism is when you look at the physical world and you see that it is governed by impersonal forces and that things will necessarily happen in a cycle of cause and effect. We've talked about this before. An apple tree must produce apples in the same way that 2 + 2 must result in 4. The fairy tale philosopher is not fatalistic. When she sees a green leaf, or a waterfall, or a honeybee, she is delighted because those things could have been different. The leaf could have been red, the water could have flowed up, and the bee could just as well be producing peanut butter. In these things, it feels like a decision has been made. Choice does not fit into fatalism. It's basically the opposite. The universe does what it does because it must. Well, if that's the case, you could argue, and Chesterton does, that nothing has really happened then since the beginning. The modern world as I found it was solid for modern Calvinism, for the necessity of things being as they are. But when I came to ask them, I found that they really had no proof of this unavoidable repetition in things except the fact that things were repeated. Now, the mere repetition made the things to me rather more weird than more rational. It was as if, having seen a curious shaped nose in the street and dismissed it as an accident, I had then seen 6 other noses of the same astonishing shape. I should have fancied for a moment that it must be some local secret society. So one elephant having a trunk was odd. But all elephants having trunks look like a plot. I speak here only of an emotion, and of an emotion at once stubborn and subtle. But the repetition in nature seemed sometimes to be an excited repetition, like that of an angry schoolmaster saying the same thing over and over again. The grass seemed signaling to me with all its fingers at once. The crowded stars seemed bent upon being understood. The sun would make me see him if he rose 1,000 times. The recurrences of the universe rose to a maddening rhythm of an incantation, and I began to see an idea. The repetition that fatalists use as evidence is all circumstantial. It's indirect, and it requires an inference to make a connection, for instance, between the blossom and the apple. Anyone who has seen a courtroom drama knows that circumstantial evidence is a lot weaker than direct evidence, because it relies on inference, and that means it can be open to interpretation and potential error. Mere repetition does not mean determinism. Sure, chickens coming from eggs and apples from blossoms has been observed many times. Chesterton says that this kind of thing suggests a plot, or an incantation, or a lesson that someone really wants us to understand. I like that. These things seem like a decision has been made by someone. All the towering materialism which dominates the modern mind rests ultimately upon one assumption, a false assumption. It is supposed that if a thing goes on repeating itself, it is probably dead, a piece of clockwork. People feel that if the universe was personal, it would vary. If the sun were alive, it would dance. This is a fallacy even in relation to known fact. For the variation in human affairs is generally brought into them not by life, but by death, by the dying down or breaking off of their strength or desire. A man varies his movements because of some slight element of failure or fatigue. He gets into an omnibus because he is tired of walking, or he walks because he is tired of sitting still. But if his life and joy were so gigantic that he never tired of going to Islington, he might go to Islington as regular as the Thames goes to Sheerness. The very speed and ecstasy of his life would have the stillness of death. The sun rises every morning. I do not rise every morning, but the variation is due not to my activity, but to my inactivity. Now, to put the matter to a popular phrase, it might be true that the sun rises regularly because he never gets tired of rising. His routine might be due not to lifelessness, but to a rush of life. The thing I mean can be seen, for instance, in children, when they find some game or joke that they specially enjoy. A child kicks his legs rhythmically through excess, not absence of life. Because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. They always say, "Do it again." And the grown-up person does it again until he is nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. But perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, "Do it again," to the sun, and every evening, "Do it again," to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never got tired of making them. It may be that He has an eternal appetite for infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. The repetition in nature may not be a mere recurrence. It may be a theatrical encore. Heaven may encore the bird who laid an egg. If the human being conceives and brings forth a human child instead of bringing forth a fish or a bat or a griffin, the reason may be that we are not fixed in an animal fate without life or purpose. It may be that our little tragedy has touched the gods, that they admire it from their starry galleries, and that at the end of every human drama, man is called again and again before the curtain. Repetition may go on for millions of years by mere choice, and at any instant it may stop. Man may stand on the earth generation after generation, and yet each birth be his positively last appearance. Modern materialism rests on one false assumption. The assumption that all this repetition is a signal that the cosmos is a dead thing. One of the metaphors for the universe that had been popular in the century before Chesterton was that the universe was like a clock. Clocks are dead. They do what they must do. This idea is false. As a matter of fact, it's contrary to our experience. Variation tends to be more a product of death than life. Chesterton gave us a lot of examples of how this is so. I love it when he gets on a roll, as he does in this paragraph. Life seems to inspire repetition, and death variation. Kids are totally like Chesterton describes. I have a whole mess of grandchildren, and when they are at their most alive, their favorite word is again. They can do the same thing 1,000 times, and when I'm worn out by throwing them into the air, I can exploit this same tendency and calm them down by reading the same book that they've already read 1,000 times. In God there is bounteous life. What if all that repetition in creation is because our Creator is very much like a 2-year-old in His delight? This was my first conviction made by the shock of my childish emotions meeting the modern creed in mid-career. I had always vaguely felt facts to be miracles in the sense that they are wonderful. Now I began to think them miracles in a stricter sense, that they were willful. I mean that they were or might be repeated exercises of some will. In short, I had always believed that the world involved magic. Now I thought that perhaps it involved a magician, and this pointed to profound emotion always present and subconscious, that this world of ours has some purpose. And if there is a purpose, there is a person. I had always felt life first as a story, and if there is a story, there is a storyteller. Chesterton is talking about facts. By facts he means things like blossoms becoming apples, waterfalls flowing downhill, leaves being green. Some of us have lived too long in a disenchanted world to get all that excited that mass of dotted jelly would turn into tadpoles, which would in turn turn into frogs. Most adults would think, well, that's just what happens. But children, and those of us who seriously read fairy tales, never lost the miracle of such things. Early on, Chesterton saw these things as a form of magic, but then he began to realize that if you have magic, there has to be a magician. Like if you have a story, there has to be an author, a consciousness behind the wonderful things that we see in the world. And this sets us up for part 4 of the Ethics of Elfland, where Chesterton explains how this fairy tale ethic becomes a full-blown worldview. That is, Orthodox Christian belief. Thank you, and I'll see you there.